So today what we'll be doing is a little watercolor ink of a cottage house. So I already have my little drawing of the house kind of planned out. I didn't draw every single little line I need for the house because some of that I'm going to be putting in with ink. The most important thing is when you're first starting to draw a house, be it your house or a historical home or anything like that, you always want to make sure that you have your main lines nice and straight and you have that structure, and then from there you can kind of have a little bit of fun with it. So it is kind of nice to have some plants with houses because then it makes it look more lively and interesting. So I'll sometimes even add extra plants if a photo doesn't have those plants. And also sometimes it's kind of nice to add, little details about the house or the history, and kind of getting rid of things that aren't necessarily important. So like maybe a part of this house was falling apart, you could always put it together a little bit. But as long as you have kind of the main structure of the house and its character and details, that's really what's going to make it look like this house. So since I already have my kind of pencil lines on, I can always come in because I did a drawing and then transferred it onto my watercolor paper. But if I forgot something that's really important, I can always very, very lightly kind of draw it onto the watercolor paper. That's perfectly fine because as long as you're drawing it very lightly, it's not really going to harm the watercolor paper. But that is a reason why I transfer my drawings, just because if I, have a lot of sketchy lines and pencil lines, a lot of times it'll push down onto the paper. And then, once you put the watercolor on top, you can sometimes see all of those lines. So I'm going to start off first with adding my ink details. So I have a 0.05 and a 0.2. So the 0.5 is my smallest pen, and I'm going to go ahead and use that for kind of just outlining all of my drawing, and I'll also use it for some of the plant details. So for this step, you can use a ruler if you would like, or you can kind of freehand it, and that adds a little whimsicality to it. But some of the main structural lines like these, I would recommend kind of using a ruler. So I have my overall drawing outlined in ink. So I can make it as detailed or as simple as I want it to be. So some of these bricks up here, I could go ahead and draw in some of that texture using my pen. Even the door, there is actually kind of a little bit of detail in the middle of the door, so that's kind of optional because sometimes if we add too much with the ink, we regret it later. So it's good sometimes to do less because I can always come back in and add more, but can't really take it off. So, and even on the roof itself, I could do maybe some little horizontal lines just for some roof texture. That can also be something you could always just add in later. And then I can always also go back in and kind of re-outline some things that maybe I want to stand out a little bit more. And I'm not terribly worried at some of my extra kind of pencil lines that are going on down there. And then next what I'm going to start with is laying in some of the main colors of my house. So I'm just using a number 6 round brush. You could always use a little bit smaller depending how big this is. This is actually probably better for the sky, and then I'll use this brush for kind of mostly the house. So this one is a number 3 round, but of course, depending on different brands, sometimes a number 3 in one brand is ginormous compared to a number 3 in another brand. So it's always good to watch out for that. So I'm going to come in, and this house is mostly yellow. So, and you could always do a different color if you want to, or go exactly by the photo. For this one, I'm going to go exactly by the photo. So I'm going to be taking some cadmium yellow, making a really nice light wash. And it does look like it's almost a little creamy yellow. So I might add actually a little tiny bit of yellow ochre to it. And even when I'm doing the wash and kind of the beginning stages on my house, I always want to think about the shading and the shadows, because that's really going to give my house some definition. So first I'm going to kind of come in and just do yellow all around my windows and my little plants. And it's okay if a little bit gets on the plants, just because yellow is typically the color we use kind of for the main wash on plants. And I'm always looking at my reference to make sure I'm not putting color where it's not supposed to go. And then I'm going to come in with a little bit of a darker yellow, which again, it's kind of more just using a little bit more yellow ochre, and I'm going to put it right underneath my roof, which if you notice it doing this, that means you have too much water. So I might just try and spread that color while I have it, and trying to use a little bit less this time. And I'm just kind of dropping it in while it's still wet, and I'll do a lot more of these shadows once it's a little drier. So while that's drying, since most of the yellow is kind of away from the background, I can actually do a little bit of a sky behind my house, or I could do like in the photo and do some trees. But I like doing skies, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to take some water, a little bit of my cerulean blue, which if you don't have cerulean blue, ultramarine blue is also a good, nice blue. Sometimes I'll even add that to my cerulean. It makes it a little bit more realistic. And then I'm actually going to be wetting my paper first. And I'm being very careful, even though I'm going very quickly, but I'm being very careful to try and go around my house as best as I can. So then, you know, you kind of avoid unnecessary bleeding. And then I'm going to take my blue I'm just going to be painting the negative of my clouds, just kind of dropping in some blue. You know, and it's up to you how far down you want the blue to go, especially if there's any really light areas. I try and have my blue a little bit darker near any light parts of the house because it really helps add a lot of more contrast. And I'm just going to kind of fade some of those. And you know, you don't have to have perfect lines. I didn't tape this off, but that's up to you if you like kind of taping it off and giving it a nice border, or kind of leaving it a little more loose. So there's my little sky. And you can make it as loose or as, you know, detailed as you want it to. I could always lift a little bit more with a slightly wet brush, or also my Kleenex. And then if there's a little bit of leakage, also I can lift my paintbrush. And then I'm also going to come in with a gray using burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. And I'm just going to put a little bit of that at the bottom of each of my clouds. And sometimes just working it a little bit into my sky. And if you have any hard edges, that's where you take just a tiny bit of water to try and help just kind of loosen that up a little bit. There. Now I have my sky done. And again, you know, if it gets too dark, you can always try and lift a little bit more. I really like stormy days. And then while that's drying, I'm going to come in and do a little bit of details on my windows. So I'm going to take my small brush again, and for windows, you can kind of use the colors that are actually in the window picture, or sometimes you can just reflect kind of the sky that's around it. But since my house is so light, I'm going to go a little dark, kind of like in the picture. I'm taking some Payne's gray and just leaving some little white spots, kind of like reflections. Because with windows, you don't want them to be perfectly flat in one color, because one, that's boring, and two, it's not very realistic. Because if you look at a window, there's normally a little bit of reflection from where the light is hitting it. And I could make it a little happier by putting a little blue in there, like it's being reflected. And then I'm going to do a light layer of, let's see, gray on my stairs, because there are some little stairs down there. So I'm going to take a really light wash of gray, and I'm just painting the whole entire stairs with that light wash. And then down here is more of a terracotta, so I'd probably want to wait for it to be dry, but it's okay since I'm not using too much water. That's kind of like our little path that our stairs lead down to. And then I'm going to take a little bit of a darker gray, which is just using that same gray but with less water. And I'm going to go and make kind of the underside of the stairs a little dark. And that makes these little highlights show up even more. And our roof is also another type of gray, but it's more on the yellowy gray. So I might take a little yellow, mix it in with my gray, but also if you don't like some of the colors that are in this picture, you could always kind of change it up a little bit. There's nothing wrong with that. That's kind of our job as artists, is kind of playing around with what we want it to look like. And then this part here is also a little bit of the roof. And then, let's see, our sky is fairly dry. So I'm going to take some cadmium red and a little bit of burnt sienna, which is a great way to make kind of a brick color. And I'm just going to do a light wash of that color on my little chimneys. And I'm going to come back in later and add some texture on those. Watercolor is all about kind of jumping around and being patient with your paintings. And then there is a little bit of that orange in some of our shadows. So since our house is a little bit drier now, I can actually start working those in. And you don't want to mess around and, try and blend things too often, because sometimes doing a little more direct painting where you don't touch it very much, adds a lot more contrast to your house. And just looking for those little shadow shapes in here really helps to, add depth to your house, make the roof look like it's kind of leaning and going over kind of this little area. So, and you can also use gray for a lot of your shadows going on top of your oranges and whites. And then while that's drying, I'm actually going to start working on kind of all the flowers and greenery that's around the house. So with my greens, a lot of times instead of starting straight with green, I'll start with yellows, which actually I'm going to do a yellowy green with my sap green and some cadmium yellow. And I'm going to use this color to start kind of dropping it in, but also leaving some little white highlights and space for some flowers. And also it kind of leaves the illusion of highlights in my plants. So, and for my plants, I don't have to make my highlight color the same everywhere. I can also make kind of a light bluey green just by adding a little bit of blue to my light green mixture. So down here, I'm going to have kind of some cool color plants. So I'm going to use this as my wash instead of the yellowy green. I'm going to put that wash also on this side. And then while that's still wet, I'm going to start coming in with some of my flower colors. So you don't have to do exactly what's in your photo for those flower colors. You can just do kind of your favorite colors, but I would try and avoid a lot of the colors that are in the house, because that'll help add more contrast, because you don't want like yellow flowers on a yellow house. Very boring. So I'm adding some pinks in some places. And I'm going to add some pinks down here. Kind of some fun purples. Then I made a really nice dark green with my sap green and Payne's gray. I added a little bit more blue to it as well. And I'm going to use this just to kind of start dropping in some shadows behind a lot of my plants, and that's really going to help to separate all these little foliage areas. I can also use some salt, because that really helps to add some more texture. I'll be coming back in later to add some darker colors to my flowers. Because right now it's so wet, it's just gonna muddle all together. Now I'm also gonna come back in on my roof and do another coat. I could also do some dry brushing, which is where you use very little water and just kind of drop in colors. This isn't really dry brushing, this is more just going over it again. But you can do dry brushing just by using a lot less water. And I'm also going to work on some of my brick. So the brick colors are really great with burnt sienna and cadmium red. And I'm just going to do another coat of that color on my shadow areas, which this one is really the only one that has a little highlight on it. I can also do a little shadow behind some of these plants, like it's casting a shadow onto the house. And could do more on my shadows under the stairs. And also, even though this is white molding, it should have a little bit of shadows on the tops where it's dark underneath the porch. There you go. That's how to get started on your house. So as this would be drying, then I would kind of come back in and do, darker layers on my flowers, just trying to kind of tap in to add some texture. But right now this is so wet, can't do that very well, but that's how I would do it once it's more wet.